Great. Well, welcome everybody. I'm Vanessa Timmer. I'm a board member of Dutch Cultural Association of British Columbia, and I'm very glad to welcome you onto this webinar. We're talking about from the King's Apology to Accountability, and very happy to be joined by Professor Alex van Stipriaan Luiscius from the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, and Sylvia Vollenhoven, who's an author and playwright and artist, as well as part of the University of Johannesburg. And in a moment, we'll also hear from Sebastian Messerschmidt, the Consul General of the Netherlands in Vancouver. And I just wanted to say that this the Dutch Cultural Association of BC curates a wide range of in-person and online Netherlandic cultural and community events in and around Vancouver, and supports events and production across Canada. And we gratefully acknowledge that we're operating on the traditional and ancestral and unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. We're very grateful for their stewardship over time and their partnerships today. We also want to note that this is a big part of what this conversation is about, the reconciliation, the discussion of how we move forward, knowing that these lands are unceded. And on July 1st, something really extraordinary happened. On the Ketty Kotti Day, the King of the Netherlands, Willem-Alexander, delivered a historical apology for the role of the Netherlands has played in the global slave trade that saw colonized peoples being taken from their homelands to work as slaves on companies that enriched the Dutch state. And that apology really is close to my heart, because on my mother's side, my ancestor is Onnetje van Frederici, was born in 1763, likely in Ghana. She was brought on a slave ship from Ghana to Suriname to work in the plantations, and she is one of my ancestors. And I think a lot about how we move from this apology to accountability. And today we are joined with these wonderful presentations and guests, and I really welcome you to present your comments and questions in the chat for those of you joining us. A big hearty welcome, and I'll now hand it over to my other Dutch BC board member, Erwin Oost-Indie, to set the context for today's discussion, show a short clip of the King's Apology, hand it over to Sebastian Messerschmidt for some early opening remarks before I come back to introduce Professor Alex a little bit more. So over to you, Erwin, to set the context.
Great. Thank you, Vanessa. And I'm here with the SFU Institute for Humanities. So I want to acknowledge the Institute for Humanities for their support. Also to the Taiwan Festival, who I see Charlie Wu is here with us, and the support. This is really a lovely example of cross-cultural work as we explore these intertwined histories. And I think we'll be unpacking that today. And just to refresh the agenda that Vanessa set out, a lot of speakers. We have a tight timeline, but I think with some good intentions, we will carry off this complex conversation. There'll be some time for dialogue in the later stages of the event, and also we'll take a few minutes at the very end to let folks know about some very special programming that also builds on the work today, which is looking at the history of the VOC in Formosa in Taiwan. So we'll give you some information about that. But let's first play this clip from July 1st with the Dutch King.
Van alle vormen van onvrijheid is slavernij wel het meest kwetsend, het meest vernederend, het meest mensonterend. Een medemens zien als koopwaar, waarover je naar goeddunken kunt beschikken. Als een willoos werktuig om winst mee te maken. Dat je kunt vastketenen, verhandelen, brandmerken, afbeulen, straffen, straffeloos doden zelfs. De afgelopen tijd hebben de koningin en ik veel gesprekken gevoerd in Nederland en op de eilanden in het Caribisch deel van het Koninkrijk. We hebben gesproken met mensen die hun wortels hebben in Suriname. En ook met mensen die een binding hebben met Indonesië. Onder hen mensen die maar 3 generaties terug hoeven te gaan voor een familielid dat in slavernij werd geboren. Zij hebben ons duidelijk gemaakt hoezeer de pijn nog steeds in de haarvaten zit. Wij dragen de gruwelijkheid van het slavernijverleden met ons mee. De gevolgen daarvan zijn vandaag nog steeds te voelen in racisme in onze samenleving. Op 19 december vorig jaar heeft de minister-president namens de Nederlandse regering excuses aangeboden voor het feit dat mensen in naam van de Nederlandse staat eeuwenlang tot handelswaar zijn gemaakt, zijn uitgebuit en mishandeld. Vandaag sta ik hier voor u. Als uw koning en als deel van de regering maak ik vandaag deze excuses zelf.
Yeah, so I just want to acknowledge that the broader context of today is welcoming this cross-cultural dialogue for members, welcoming members of the Taiwanese community as well for today, also welcoming members of the Dutch community in British Columbia. And one of the legacy pieces of today's educational discussion is to have this opportunity to start to unpack the issues of the legacy of slavery for Dutch settlers and Dutch emigres as we move away from the Netherlands. So of course, there's an opportunity to think about the Dutch settlers moving to South Africa, Dutch settlers moving to Canada. So those are some of the things that I'll be thinking about as I listen to the speakers. And Vanessa, would you like to introduce Alex?
Well, we'll first hear from our Consul General in Vancouver, Sebastian Messerschmidt. And Sebastian, you've had lots of experience over many continents also and working with the ministry in the Netherlands. If you can just speak a little bit about what this conversation means to you.
Let me start out. I'm really honored to be part of this, to be with Professor Stipriaan and Sylvia Vollenhoven. Listen, it's a very personal thing. In 2014, I played Zwarte Piet, blackface, and thought that was totally normal, even though friends of mine were saying, "What are you doing?" And it took me posting in South Africa to understand how hurtful and painful dressing up as a Black Piet is to other people, which I really didn't understand the depth of it. You got to remember 2018 was before Black Lives Matter hit Europe. So the whole slavery past and discrimination were all very touchy subjects that weren't very much in the political realm and were not very much touched upon the political realm. So I asked my team, we're Dutch here. We have a East India Company VOC past. What should I do? And my team confronted me with Adrian van Wyk, a movie maker in Cape Town. And I asked him, said, what should I do as a new Consul General? And he looked at me and he says, you need to do two things. You need to shut up and listen, and don't come to me with your white guilt. Which means, he says, I don't want your interpretation of the past, because it's my journey to find out who I am in relation to my past that I share with you because of your slavery activations in the 17th century and afterwards. Second thing, if you come to me with an apology and think that you can end the discussion, then you're actually being counterproductive. Because I want you to be in the room to receive the emotions, to receive the pain, and to be there and to understand what we're going through, because that will help us, and then in the end will help you. I've taken that as a mantra. It's become a very personal journey to find out what white privilege means, what it means to be male, to be Dutch, to be white. And therefore, I'm very much looking forward to today, as well as I'm now in the Canadian context, trying to find out how the Canadians deal with the First Nations and what the Dutch factor is in this, and how people personally relate to all of that. So I'm thrilled to hear more. I'm a big fan of Sylvia Vollenhoven. She and Basil Apollos put together Krotoa Eva van de Kaap, which is a story about the VOC from a First Nations Indigenous point of view. She can tell you a lot more about it. I won't. And also, I'm thrilled because the King's speech, it gives me the good goosebumps. That I'm thrilled that we're finally embarking on this journey. And I'm very happy that our Prime Minister said it's a comma, it's not a period at the end of a sentence. This is a journey. Makes me very hopeful, because of course we want to end up at that place where we can look each other in the eye and acknowledge what the past has done to us, what it means today, and then we can move forward regardless of our skin color, regardless of our background, regardless of the language we speak, and see each other as humans. So I would like to leave it at that. It's a subject I can talk about for hours, but I won't, because I want to listen and shut up to people who have studied and know a lot more and have a more experience to bring to the table.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. And you've, of course, spent 27 years as a diplomat and policy officer with the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And you also had time as a Consul General in Cape Town and now in Vancouver. And we've had lots of very powerful conversations about exactly this, also the Dutch BC community. So now it's my great pleasure to actually introduce our first speaker, official presenter, Professor Dr. Alex van Stipriaan Luiscius, who's a professor emeritus of Caribbean history and Culture at the history department of Erasmus University's School of History, Culture, and Communications in Rotterdam. And in a moment, Sylvia Vollenhoven will be joining us as well. It's great to see you both here. Thank you both for being here. Alex, your research is focused on Afro-Caribbean history and developments in cultural heritage and the arts, particularly of Suriname and the Dutch Caribbean, as well as on processes of creolization in what is often called the Black Atlantic. You're the author of many publications and won awards for them, including Rotterdam in the Slavernij book, which won the Dultith Prize. You've been a Keti Koti speaker also in the Netherlands. And so we're just thrilled to have you here to bring your perspective on the Netherlands and this apology, this moment in history, and also the history of the Netherlands and the global slave trade. I pass it over to you, Alex. Thank you so much, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, and it's an honor to be with you. Well, thank you very, very much for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts with you and to be with you over a great distance in kilometers or miles in between Amsterdam. I'm living in Amsterdam, but I worked at Rotterdam, in between Vancouver and the Netherlands. So I'm going to talk about slavery, the history of slavery, and the meaning of Keti Koti. So the 1st of July, we call Keti Koti in the Netherlands these days. And Keti Koti is Sranang Tongo, that's the Surinamese language for the chains are broken. And in Papiamento, which is the common language in what they call the Lesser Antilles, Bonaire, Aruba, and Curacao, they say desencadena, which means the same, the chains are broken. And in Indonesian, it is called rantai rusak, which also means the chains are broken. And that means that the 1st of July, we commemorate the people who had to live in slavery under Dutch rule, and that we celebrate that this system was officially ended on the 1st of July, 1863. And this year is a special memorial year because that event took place 160 years ago. For Suriname, the formerly enslaved were still obliged to continue working for another 10 years, albeit against a wage and without the whip and not being one's property anymore. The 6 Dutch Caribbean islands didn't have such a 10-year period of obliged contract labor, which was called in the British Caribbean the apprenticeship period or apprenticeship system. However, in those islands, many of the liberated they were forced to really strangling land-rent relationships with their former slave owners. And these relationships, they were called terra paga terra, often continued well into the 20th century. In the Netherlands, and Sebastian referred already to that, there was not so much public awareness about the slavery past until, say, about 3 decades ago. 3 decades ago, some fierce discussions started about the creation of a national slavery monument in Amsterdam. That was a location where the king apologized for the slavery history. And that discussion became even more passionate and fierce with the Black Piet, Zwarte Piet is racism discussion. That started some 10 years after the unveiling of the slavery monument in 2002. And finally, the Black Lives Matter demonstrations in 2020, which were held in many, many places in the Netherlands, which cannot be separated from the history of slavery, was a third instance of becoming aware of that slave history. Now, for the first time, even the Dutch government now dares, since a few years at max, now dares to use publicly terms such as racism and even institutional racism. For example, in relation to a number of governmental and police dramas in the recent years. Until very recently, when the government commented such affairs, they never went beyond the term discrimination. Racism was not in their formal dictionary. And the government, including the king, have now formally apologized for a horrific slavery past. So something is changing. Now, to understand something of the relationship between the slavery past and the present, we should have, of course, some knowledge of that past. And that's what I will focus upon on the next part of my presentation. First and foremost, I have to say that Dutch slavery took place on 3 continents: Africa, Asia, and the Americas. In total, about 1.5 to 2 million people were brought into slavery under the Dutch flag worldwide. For a number of reasons, and maybe we could get into that during the discussion afterwards or the dialogue, but for a number of reasons, I will focus on the Dutch Atlantic system, in which around 600,000 Africans were forced to cross the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, in slavery. The process of enslavement in the Atlantic contained a consecutive number of traumatizing stages. But you see here the slide on slavery in the territory under the VOC. So there was a lot of slavery in South Africa, of course, in Asia, from India to Sri Lanka to the other colonies, Indonesia, of course. But I won't talk about that for this particular moment. So making someone into a slave, enslaving a person, was a process of a number of traumatizing phases or stages. It began when African men, women, children were captured during wars and slave raids in the Western and Central African parts of Africa, of course, mainly by local armies and African human traffickers. And they were then forced to walk for weeks to the Atlantic coast, tied to each other. A large number of them died underway. They were then imprisoned and sold for European commodities to frightening-looking white men. And directly after being sold, they were brandmarked with signs that they didn't understand, which were the initials of the Dutch trading companies or other Dutch buyers. Anonymously, they were loaded in ships, and after about 3 months of sailing, they reached the Americas. Along the way, on average, 1 in every 7 Africans on board died. 3 months of being imprisoned in the lower decks, the men tied to iron rods. 3 months living in the smell of piss and shit and sweat and menstrual liquids and fear. For women and girls, 3 months of fear to be raped. The women's deck was suggestively named by the crew the Whore's Hole. After arrival in Suriname or Guyana or one of the Caribbean islands, the enslaved were led through the city in groups so that everyone who was willing to buy could view them well. The final point of that walking tour was an area where a public auction was held. Again, you will be viewed and touched like a cow for sale, screaming pain and the scent of scorched meat when they press for the second time within a couple of months a red-hot brand mark in your shoulder with characters that you don't understand, but that you carry the rest of your life. You have been sold again, although you have not the slightest idea what that means. Instead of Comenina, Yaba, Afiba, or other West African or Central African names, from now on you will be called, for example, Goliath, Prophet, or Monkey. In that unknown country, you then leave for an unknown place that you will no longer leave for the rest of your life. Where strangers determine to the smallest details how you have to live, and where the most important labor incentive consists of the whip. Enslaved could get corporal punishment for almost everything. A Swedish traveler in Suriname observed in 1755 that, I quote, "the repeated blows of whips sound daily in the city houses. The least violation condemns the miserable black servants to a punishment that is terrible to hear and miserable to see." End of quote. If an enslaved person left the plantation at night to sleep with a partner on a neighboring plantation, and he or she was caught while returning the next morning, the punishment could be up to 80 whiplashes during the 18th century. Even at the very end of slavery in the 1850s, men and women were still legally, by law, given 15 to 25 lashes if they had worked badly or insufficiently in the eyes of the supervisor. A number, these 15 to 25 lashes, could be doubled by the plantation owner or his representative, the administrator. And maybe even more impactful than punishment itself was the mere threat of physical violence in every enslaved life. Imagine that. The threat was there 24/7, lifelong, to be whiplashed or whatever. That physical as well as psychological violence was omnipresent all the time. And therefore it was maybe even more the threat of physical violence than the physical violence itself, or the combination of the two, which was one of the main pillars of the slave system. An enslaved person had no rights, only duties. In colonial law, enslaved were defined as movable property, as a commodity like a wheelbarrow or a donkey, not humans. As a commodity, you cannot rely on the judiciary. You cannot get married or have property of yourself. You don't learn to read and you don't learn to write. You cannot come to the church of the Europeans, and you are forbidden to have sex with a white person. Only the latter rule was violated massively by the white man, because as slave owners, they thought that their slaves were also their sexual property, and therefore they behaved like they should do with their property, whatever pleased them. This system of segregation or apartheid, in which the white man drew the lines between himself and the enslaved blacks, was at the same time deeply paradoxical. On the one hand, the system denied the humanity of enslaved by juridically defining them as commodities, while at the other hand, the enslaved were forced to do things and to behave in a way only humans can do. You can't tell a donkey to understand or do the things a human laborer can do. So people were enslaved because only humans could do what they were expected to do. And at the same time, that same human being was denied his or her humanity. That is the paradox of slavery. Violence as well as legalized racial apartheid were the basis of the system. But there was another instrument added to that, and that's an age-old instrument in say, all rigid and dictatorial systems, which is divide and rule policy. Enslaved people were stimulated to betray each other and therefore to mistrust each other. Divide and rule also meant that some were given privileges while suppressing the others rigidly. And this was added to the racial hierarchy, a racial, so there was a labor hierarchy which was linked up and paralleled by a racial hierarchy. The lighter one's skin color, the more opportunities one had to eventually get one's freedom. And the lighter one's skin color, the higher one could rise in colonial society, though never to the same level as whites. The fact that those color differences had come into being was the result, of course, of white men having children with black women, who in turn had again children with white men or with people of mixed descent. Enslaved of mixed descent, so-called mulattoes, got the better jobs in slavery. They didn't have to perform field work, but learned a trade, such as carpenter or cooper or mason, or for women midwife, or they became house slaves. And sometimes the white father even recognized his colored offspring and gave them their freedom. And sometimes the enslaved craftsmen and women were eventually able to buy their own freedom and that of their relatives. All that is the basis of divide and rule, give some privileges and suppress the other more rigidly. All these different shades of color were defined by different names, and you might be familiar with that. And they were linked to that racial hierarchy. The lighter one's color, the more chances one could expect. White was good, black was bad. And the impact of that kind of thinking can still be felt today, because it didn't stop with the abolition of slavery in 1863. On the contrary, now that physical and violent slavery was abolished in 1863, the psychological oppression became the most important instrument of the small group of colonial rulers to keep the large group of colonial dominated persons in control. Moreover, racial divide and rule was, since the beginning of the 19th century, increasingly supported by white science, which defined a hierarchy of races with connotations of levels of civilization and volume of brains for each different race. This white perception of humanity was developed as a result of slavery and colonialism. Europeans and white North Americans believed and propagated this racial hierarchy as the natural state of humanity. It was only since the 1950s and 60s and further on in the 70s that biologically and genetically such a racial layout was declared absolute nonsense. And that's very recent. Genetically, we are one large human family with minimal internal differences. However, perceptions of races and often subconscious or semi-conscious connotations of assumed superiority and inferiority has not disappeared, not at all. Biologically, race has disappeared. However, as a so-called social construction, race is still very much alive and is used to discriminate between people by their outer appearances. And these, for centuries imagined and ingrained racial worldviews are structurally internalized as truth by whites and to a certain extent by people of color as well. Because until today, until this very day, white rules, despite increasing North Asian competition, but white still rules. So the impact of slavery on Dutch society cannot be underestimated. First of all, because the Dutch once were there, the descendants of enslaved and colonized inhabitants of the colonies have moved here to the Netherlands. And despite having been civilized by the Dutch for several centuries, and now even living for several generations in the Netherlands, their position in Dutch society is structurally unequal compared to the position of native Dutch. I give you just 2 telling examples, but I could give you many, many more. Many more can be found in the yearly reports of the National Bureau of Statistics. But it hardly reaches the national news broadcasts anymore. Sometimes it does, most of the times it doesn't. The unequal position of Surinamese and Caribbean Dutch in the Netherlands. They have on average incomes which are 17 to 23%, so to almost a quarter lower than that of native Dutch. 17 to 23% lower income per household for Surinamese Dutch and Caribbean Dutch. That's stunning. Second one, average advices for at the end of primary school for secondary education are significantly higher for native Dutch children than for children of Surinamese or Dutch Caribbean descent, which now after 3, maybe even 4 generation actually should be called native Dutch as well. Now, 2 pressing questions remain. Questions which often pop up in debates on the impact of slavery. And one is the idea that slavery was generally accepted in those days. And the other is the idea that apart from merchants and officials in the port cities like Amsterdam and Rotterdam, and maybe in Zealand, most people in the Netherlands had nothing to do with slavery and colonialism, and had no knowledge of these overseas affairs. So the 2 questions I will address now are, was there no opposition or resistance against slavery or to slavery? And was slavery an unknown phenomenon for common Dutch people with which they had nothing to do whatsoever? And I start with the latter question. Almost everything I know about slavery, not 100% because there are other historical sources as well, but a majority of the things I know about slavery come from archival documents. And those documents are there in the archives in the Netherlands, in Suriname, in the Caribbean islands for centuries. And they have passed through many, many hands in those days. So people read all those reports, all those letters, all those documents on slavery. Second observation is commodities for the slave trade, as well as for the slave colonies. And that went from ships to cheese, and from textiles to liquor and nails and clay bricks, etc., etc. They were all produced in the Netherlands and in its neighboring countries. And these commodities came from the smallest countryside villages to the largest port cities. Another tens of thousands of people worked in factories processing the produce from the plantations in the Americas, such as sugar, coffee, tobacco, and from those factories in the Netherlands, it was distributed all over Europe. One way or another, most people in this country were at least partly involved in slavery-related production and trade. And you can see it in this list. The list goes on for 5 pages, and it names a lot of cities, but also a number of small villages all over the Netherlands, which produced for the slave colonies in the Caribbean. And on the right side, you can see that also commodities came from Norway, from France, from Spain, from Italy, from Sweden, from Moscow. So it wasn't only the Netherlands which produced for the slave colony, it was from all over Europe through Dutch port cities that commodities went to the slave colonies, not only the Dutch, but also the French and the English, etc. Furthermore, tens of thousands have seen slavery with their own eyes, such as soldiers and sailors and craftsmen and supervisors and plantation owners and officials, etc., etc., etc. Many, many, many thousands, maybe even 100,000. And a majority of them, after a while, returned to the Netherlands and told about what they had seen at home, in church, in the pubs, other kinds of gatherings. And most of the times, probably, they didn't speak about it critically, probably even heroic stories of how they behaved in those wild colonies. But nevertheless, the stories were told. So there were stories about slavery. Slavery was not silenced at all. And another sign of knowledge about slavery in the Netherlands was that in every port city, as well as in the rich mansions all over the country, black servants could be found who had personally experienced slavery. They were living proof of the system, and they could even tell themselves about their personal experience. We have no stories about that, but it's inevitable. And finally, all through the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, clergymen have publicly preached and written in favor, but also against slavery. And due to the European Enlightenment, an increasing number of intellectuals, writers, politicians, theater people publicly pleaded for the abolishment of human trafficking, as well as the abolishment of slavery itself. And this was a lively and public debate, more than a century before the actual abolishment of slavery. And that brings me to the final question, the question whether there was any protest against slavery, of which you can see that now the answer, of course, is yes, there was protest, and there was even massive protest. There have always been voices in the Netherlands speaking out against slavery, which even became, as you can see in this slide, a national debate during the second part of the 18th century in the First National Assembly. And it even became, in the course of the 19th century, it developed into a formal abolition movement, which presented requests to the king for the abolition of slavery. And this was the reply of King William II to the first request in 1842. The slaves are generally still on such a low step of the ladder, he said, of the ladder of civilization, that they have no inclination to fulfill anything more than the common daily needs of animals. Nothing more than that can be expected of them. End of quote. This was racial thinking at its best. Racial thinking in terms of superiority or assumed superiority and inferiority. And this brings me to the part which I haven't touched upon yet, which I haven't talked about yet, but which is very, very important. And that is, of course, the freedom fights and the resistance against slavery by the enslaved themselves, from the first to the last day of slavery. In the first place, that is, of course, the battle of the indigenous people, the original the native inhabitants of this area before it was occupied by the Europeans. They were, of course, the first who fought against the Europeans, who fought for years against the Dutch invaders until they were pushed into the, let's say, the fringes of society, of colonial society. After them, and sometimes combined with them, enslaved Africans have fought against slavery until the very end of slavery, until emancipation on the 1st of July in 1863. Their fights were individually as well as collectively, and anything in between, ranging from small-scale sabotage acts, like, for example, putting sand in the machinery of a sugar factory, to large-scale uprisings, like the famous Tula uprising on Curacao in 1795, or the famous coffee uprising in Berbice, now Guyana, in 1763, or the long-term Maroon Wars, which sometimes lasted for decades. Maroons, you might be aware of that, were people who had escaped from slavery and had built up a new existence far away from colonial society. That happened all over the Americas, in Suriname, in Guyana, in Curacao. But typical for Suriname was that from those new Maroon societies far away in the interior of the countries, they attacked plantations, they attacked the colonial society. So in Suriname, their presence and their battles were so frightening and so threatening for the colonists that in the end, in mid-18th century, the colonial authorities decided to make peace with some of them, again, divide and rule policy, and recognize their autonomy in their own territories as long as they would leave the plantation alone from that moment on. But the fights went on because as a result of divide and rule, other Maroon people went on attacking plantations, and escaping from slavery went on until the last day of slavery itself. Now, all this resisting against the oppressors meant that despite the dehumanizing rigidity of the slavery system, the slavery regime, the mental and spiritual power of the enslaved people remained to a large extent unbroken. And that had everything to do with the fact that in order to survive, the enslaved Africans who came from very different cultural areas in Africa, these enslaved Africans in Suriname, as well as in the Caribbean islands, managed to develop together new Afro cultures with their own languages, their own religions, their own music, their own norms, values, ways of thinking, oral literature, etc., etc. So those relatively autonomous cultures created by their own were in itself a form of resistance, a form of fighting for your own mental health as well as for your own autonomy. And at the same time, these cultures owned and developed by yourself became a breeding ground for fighting the system, as well as that it became a symbol of independence, despite the rigidity of the system, despite everything. So these cultures were developed then and still exist in Suriname as well as in the Dutch Caribbean islands. And now, through migration, they have settled in the Netherlands too. Languages developed in slavery can now be heard in places all over the Netherlands. They are now part of society. Urban youth, no matter what color, now speak in what they call street language. And this street or youngsters language is peppered with a lot of Stranang, which is Surinamese, or Papiamento words, Papiamento from the Antilles, from the Caribbean, words and phrases. And they, most of the time, they don't realize that these words and phrases were once developed in resistance against the Dutch oppressors. And there's a lot more Afro influence in Dutch society than only this urban youth language, particularly in sports, in music, in entertainment. But that, you may be aware of, that is, of course, at the same time stereotypically, because on levels and in fields where decisions are made, which are decisive for running Dutch society, not much Afro influence or representation can be found yet. For example, in business or in finances or in politics or in science. In the slide, you see the first Black cabinet minister of the present government, but that's the first one, 2023. Nonetheless, it is this Afro-cultural battle, the resistance, and the mental power of the enslaved African ancestors, as well as the strength of their descendants, which is commemorated and celebrated too with Keti Koti. And not only by Afro-Dutch, also increasingly by others. And that is why Black Lives Matter, and other movements are so diverse today. They know that the liberation, or preferably the emancipation of white people from racial and other forms of colonial thinking, is a part of Keti Koti too, but it has to grow. Thank you.
Fantastic. Fantastic. That's a great deal of information packed into 40 minutes. Fantastic context, historical context, fantastic professor. What a rich history of historical records, which you use so eloquently to, really, and I say this guardedly, but depoliticize it to show, in particular, Dutch citizens today, the entanglement and the connectedness to that history. I think we are Dutch settlers here in Canada, and we're sitting here unpacking this question of how do we move from the apology to accountability. And I think the opportunity that you've laid out is an example of how this is also work that's happening in Nederland. And I think with our next speaker, it's also a question of what is the role of storytelling, and what is the role of history? How do we tell our stories of history, and how can that support people to bring this question of accountability into mainstream? And I think you've shared well the question of economics, that this is not just a question of history, this is a question of today. In your latter part, you talked about who economically benefits. I think we can look at here in Canada, where Dutch settlers participate in colonialism here in Canada, that we can also look at probably the same statistical profile of Indigenous people and the graduation rates from high school and the social indicators of health. They're the exact same as you just showed. We could literally replace previous colonized subjects with Indigenous people in Canada. It's the same demographic. So thank you for that rich history, that powerful talk. We'll come back to you with questions, but I want to shift and with the conversation and bring Sylvie into this. Sylvia, you are an author, an award-winning journalist, playwright, filmmaker, also a professor of practice at the Faculty of Humanities in University of Johannesburg. Your play, Krotoa, Eva van de Kap, is the story of a young woman who grew up as a servant in the household of a 17th century Dutch colonial commander, Jan van Riebeek. It premiered in 2018 and ran to sold-out shows both in Nederland and in South Africa. We are the Dutch Cultural Association of BC, so it's fitting that we bring both of you as guest speakers into this conversation to help equip us to unpack this question of within this liberal society, how do we take responsibility? If this liberal society is so just, how do we connect to this history of the past, the apology, and then how do we move forward to be accountable? So we're going to come back with some questions and discussion with you and also the community that's come together. But Sylvia, over to you.
Thank you, Owen, and thank you, Alex. That was such a well-grounded, thoughtful, and extremely helpful context for what we need to talk about. So I'm going to share my screen first of all, and start by, oops, I just need to get this over. Sita itse tui kwatse, tukua wamkelekele. Kite says, greetings. I will begin by paying our respects to the First Nations custodians of South Africa, our land, and of the territory now known as British Columbia, and by acknowledging that this event is being held virtually, but also on the traditional lands of the indigenous people, both here and there where you are. We pay our respects to our elders past, present, and future, and to our ancient cultures and connections to land, sea, and community. Sidagera Tswatswa, Tita ge miba he hage barataken. And that is my name, my spiritual name in South Africa, the last part anyway. Oh, I can't seem to move this forward. Ah, there we go. So, oops. From apology to accountability, what exactly does that mean where I find myself? So I've designed a little bit of a timeline because I feel it is important for us, if we are going to be talking about such hugely emotional and historically important things, that we see the issues that we are raising from a diversity of points of view. So for me, this timeline, which ends in July 2023 with the King's apology, started on the other hand, on the other side of it, in May 2012. And I just want you to quickly follow this thread with me. In May 2012, I was extremely ill and spent thousands and thousands of hundreds of thousands of rand trying to find specialists and doctors in South Africa that could help. And one after the other, doctors told me there was nothing they could do, and I was just getting sicker and sicker, and I had to give up a really amazing job working for the Gates Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in West Africa, and come back home to South Africa. Finally, I found a Sangoma, which is in South African terms a traditional healer, who told me that I had an ancestral calling. And a long story short, I wrote a book about all of this experience, an experience of coming to terms with my history, my identity, my culture as a First Nations woman of the Khoikhoi people. The book was published in 2016. A couple of years later, I was approached by mainly the Volksoperhuis, Jeff Hofmeister and the team. And I started working with Basil Apollos and the people of the Volksoperhuis, as well as the collaborators at Artscape Theatre in Cape Town, on a play about a woman called Krotoa who lived in the 1600s and who was a servant in the household of a Dutch colonial commander. The very first thing we did was to go to the castle where Krotoa lies buried, and is the castle that is still in Cape Town, built on the site where she lived and grew up. And we conducted ancient rituals, Khoikhoi rituals, with the people from Volksoperhuis and ourselves to ask permission to tell the story. The play opened in October 2018 at the Bijlmer Park Theatre in Amsterdam, toured the Netherlands for 6 weeks before opening the following year in February in Cape Town. And wherever we went, sold out houses, standing ovations. It has had several runs in South Africa. One of the most emotional for us was in June 2022, when we became part of something called Co-Create SANL, when Sebastian Messerschmidt was the Consul General in Cape Town. And this was a collective artistic and venture with South Africans and Dutch people coming together to re-envision the future and to really examine what it means, what our collective and joint histories mean. And we developed along the line also intense outreach. And all of this, the book in 2016, the play that came further down the line, and the public impact campaigns that we designed mainly aimed at the youth, played into an intense First Nation revivalism that is currently happening in South Africa, and which also connects with First Nations activism around the world. And in October 2022, we had some of the biggest, at a South African arts festival, some of the biggest audiences ever. We had 1,400 high school kids coming to see the plays and going into workshops with us afterwards. And they produced art about their reactions to the themes of history, culture, and identity raised in the play. And that is the background for then an apology in December 2022 from the Dutch Premier, and early this year, a huge ceremony at the Stellenbosch University in South Africa, where a building was renamed Kritoa. So the huge ceremony in May this year at the Stellenbosch University, which, as I said, was at the forefront of apartheid in South Africa. Somebody the other day wrote an article calling it the intellectual factory for apartheid, was really, really significant. And that for us is the context of an apology from the Dutch king in July 2023. We see it as part of a process that has been started by ancestral guidance and that is now affecting and involving people all over the world. I really like the fact that Sebastian always mentions this encounter with the Cape Town filmmaker, because when he wrote that piece about his encounter with that man, I really, it spoke to me, and it made me start to think about who speaks, who listens, and who is present, who is in the room. You know, shut up and listen is an injunction that I think I've carried with me since then. Because before Africans speak, especially on important things, we listen. And what is different for us is that we listen to everyone in the room, paying primary attention to our ancestors. So when an apology comes from a Dutch king, it started somewhere else. This is something we understand very, very clearly. Just sitting and listening, what does that mean for us? I'm not going to get this Inuit word right, so I'm apologizing right off the top, especially to people like Marie, but for me it sounds something like Kwatsiluni, sitting together in the darkness, waiting for something to happen or to burst forth, that anticipatory quiet before a moment is happening. And that speaks to me because there is a South African concept called lalela, which is the concept of deep, deep listening. Who do we listen to? Primarily as Africans, we listen to the ancestors. Pabo, a 19th century Bushman visionary who is an intrinsic part of the story of the book that I mentioned earlier on. The book is called The Keeper of the Kum. Kum is the word for story in a now extinct Kam language of South Africa, and it means story or account or anything told and retold. And the keeper of the Kum refers to the fact that we believe that certain people are chosen to be story guardians. And Cabo was one of those people. Story guardians can float their stories whether they are dead or alive. And he says something like this in the archives. He says, we carry our letters, our stories in our bodies. Our stories talk, they quiver, they tap. Our letters make our bodies move. Our stories make our people silent. In the silence, we feel the tapping inside. My flesh moves, my body shakes, drums beating, wings flapping, the kwe deep inside. We're listening to also artists and storytellers, because we know that everyone in the presence of the story, the significant ones anyway, is changed. And social change starts with harnessing the power of visionary artistry. Storytellers and artists prepare the ground, and politicians and others follow what has already been decided in the hearts of people. And in these moments, this moment where we find ourselves now, moments of great social transformation, important stories choose us. And I truly believe the story that we worked on, that Sebastian referred to, the play Krotoa Eva van der Kaap, is a story that chose us, all of us. The story is set in, the play is set in the present day in South Africa, where a Dutch actor and a South African actress come together to shoot a film called Krotoa Eva van der Kaap. He plays the role of Jan van Riebeeck, the VOC commander, and she plays Krotoa, a young Khoikhoi girl taken into his household. Krotoa went on to become a key negotiator and translator between the Dutch and the local people at a very young age. She was the first Khoi woman to be baptized, the first to marry a European, but she was physically and sexually abused and battered by the clash of cultures. As they act out the story, the two actors are not unscathed. They enter a whirlwind of confrontations. And during the creative process, even in their own modern worlds, Krotoa shakes them up. And the reason why the play was written like this is because we brought into the present sharply the impact of colonialism. We personalized the trauma that people carry to this day. Specific things, issues that we deal with in the play are things like the alcohol that was fed to the young slave children in his household. Alcoholism is a huge problem in the Western Cape to this day. The play is a collaboration between the Netherlands and South Africa. Written in English, Afrikaans, Dutch, and Khoikhoi Gewap. It is an example of co-creating from a space of multiple identities, to steal a phrase from Bayo Akomolafe, the African scholar. Listening to artists, I just have to share with you a piece of that youth artistry. I referred earlier on to the hundreds of youth that we brought into workshops after they had seen the Krotoa play. They painted, did finger painting, they did sculptures, they did poetry, they did performance to express what the issues raised in the play, how the issues that affected them, issues of culture, identity, and erasure more than anything else, intellectual erasure, which is a huge part of the violence of colonialism. And this is a young high school student's image of the life of Krotoa. Every day, South Africans are torn apart by unresolved trauma and the demands of their daily lives. The youth artistry was later mounted on an exhibition at the University of Stellenbosch Museum. That exhibition was also part of the renaming of the building Krotoa. The exhibition can also be found online, or the youth artistry and other complementary adult artists. And just the theme of the exhibition is now for now. And then now is the rite of passage ritual, something that Krotoa was denied when she was alive, and something which we finally, in May this year, performed for her posthumously, and which had a powerful, powerful effect on all of us that was part of it. So remembering is a special way of practicing recollection, of putting ourselves back together again differently, with the healing action of going back into history to fetch precious, intangible possessions that have been ripped out of our existence, out of our beings. We see ourselves differently when we do this.
My people had a word, no, more than a word. Khao flowed through us, lived in us, connected us. Then it left us. When it went away,
this word that is more than a word. It tumbled down the mountains and out of our mouths, a precious possession, stolen, gone. Nothing has come to fill the vacant house of the cow. Magic does not live in the home of the new words. Disconnected, broken arrows going nowhere.
Cow, 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 cow. Cow, 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 cow.
Our children play with empty words that do not speak of mystical journeys. Cow, my people had a word. Cow, so much more than a word. Cow, melodies no longer heard.
Utamas kayo, huaha kay, huaha ngaris, puruha kay, puruha ngaris. In the modern Khoi language, in Kokugova, we say no kay ngaris, and that means a divine journey.
But deep in the earth, there is a healing. The land awaits our right doing. Ancestral voices guide us back to other magical arrows and the melody of words that are more than words to the cow of now.
Just something so that we can broaden our understanding of the impact of colonialism, aggression, and slavery. We also need to listen to the scholars. Bayo Akomalafe says we need to get to know each other and we need to co-create. The work is to create community for us to hold and cultivate the resilience to stay with the trouble together. And he says he's using Donna Haraway's phrase, stay with the trouble, co-create and play from a space of multiple identities. Bayo is an author, teacher, and trans-public intellectual, a concept imagined together with and inspired by the shamanic priesthood of the healer tricksters of African culture. John A. Powell, professor of law, African American Studies and Ethnic Studies at UC Berkeley says, the trickster dwells in the cracks in modernity. Grieving together is trickster work. Playing together is trickster work. Sitting in the dark and waiting for something to happen is trickster work. In South Africa, we know that when Kagan the mantis speaks, deep listening is required. Listening to the scholars, At Stellenbosch University, there is a Center for the Study of the Afterlife of Violence and the Reparative Quest. Like toxic radioactive elements, historic violence has a half-life of hundreds of years. The center's work is focused on this quote, transgenerational transmission of trauma has become one of the primary ways in which legacies of violent histories have been understood. In February 22, the staff of the center and students joined people at the Grote Kerk, and Sebastian Messerschmidt was there that day to watch the play Krotoa Eva van der Kaap. Afterwards, led by a drama therapist, the conversation that followed was about the life of Krotoa, the historic and intergenerational trauma, and the path to justice and repair. South Africans have just begun to scratch the surface of the impact of historic colonial violence, especially on First Nations communities. And colonial violence laid the foundation for apartheid. Listening to the scholars, Dr. Memory Biwa talks about the material culture of the unconscious. She talks in a thesis called Weaving the Past with Threads of Memory, of unconscious perceptions, inner states that are not often articulated linguistically, and asks the question, how are these to be measured if these perceptions were received, transformed, and passed on in an imperceptible manner? Nadia Sermatakis, the American Greek cultural anthropologist, points out that these perceptions, which seem to have gone underground and been lost, remain in the body and await to be named. She also writes that what was previously imperceptible and now becomes real was in fact always there as an element of the material culture of the unconscious. And I believe that the work we're doing, this discussion we have today, having today, is how we are naming things that have been waiting to be named. We have to listen to the past with new ears. These are images of the castle built by Van Riebeeck and Dutch colonials where Krotoa is buried. Images that clearly show us the threads of the past in the present. Sida Geratswatswa means we are beginning in Khoikhoi. So listen and dance. And now that you've apologized, listen and learn to dance to our music. We know that when we work with our ancestors to find our place in the world, when we elevate them, everyone stands tall. I'm going to leave you just with one word of all the hundreds of words that I've poured on you in the last few minutes, and that is reparations. How about it? Kaisagangans, thank you very much to my ancestors and to everybody here, and crediting everybody that helped me put this presentation together. These are two of my favorite images of the youth artwork. Thank you.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much, Sylvie. Sylvia, you're again, as with the Dutch Cultural Association, we're very familiar with the role of culture in inspiring reflection, identity, questions of identity. But I think also specifically here we are in the unceded Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish lands. I'm not forgetting that the colonial occupying forces and the carceral system that delivered the colonialism that we benefit today as Dutch settlers here in British Columbia, that same system exported advice to the apartheid system in the 1940s, right? So the RCMP went to South Africa in the 1940s. So as much as we think this conversation today with Alex sitting in Amsterdam, thank you, Alex. It's late at night, so thank you for being with us so late at night. Sylvia, late at night as well. That these stories are connected, and that the question of denial of settlers and the role of arts and culture to pierce that, the archival work, Alex, that you presented was profound. And I know you're part of networks of storytellers and archivists and historians that are bringing that forward. A question perhaps, we just have a few minutes, and I think we'll do some announcements maybe at the top of the hour, so folks can stay for a few minutes for discussion and take off if you don't want to spend time for the announcements. But a question to both of you around this question of denial. And I know you spoke, both of you talked about the role of youth and presented young people's perceptions, maybe their lack of attachment to these national narratives that we tell ourselves about what great liberal societies we live in. But what is that role of piercing the denial? And what is your own personal experience in your own work as truth tellers, to look back in the past and to bring those stories forwards? What is your perspectives on confronting denial? And we in Canada look at denial as the other side of the coin of genocide, that you need denial to have genocide. But what are your perspectives? Whoever would like to go first.
Sylvia?
I immediately think of in the context of denial, of a film that I made about an issue around rooibos tea. Rooibos tea is a traditional South African tea that has been exported all over the world. And for many years, there was a fight to get recognition for the traditional knowledge of the Khoi and the San people as to the uses of rooibos tea. And at some point, that fight it looked like it was impossible because the denial was just so huge. But the tiny NGOs working on it, lawyers who were almost like volunteers, they were paid so little. The communities who got together, small mountain communities where the tea grows exclusively, grows nowhere else in the whole world, stood together and just fought this thing consistently for years. And I made the film of this fight that just went on and on and on. And finally, not only did they get the recognition for the traditional knowledge of the Khoi and the San people to the uses of rooibos, but they also toppled a multinational like Nestle, who was trying to claim patents for certain uses of rooibos. They won a court case in the courts in Switzerland, for instance. And finally, the bottom line was that they are now getting paid compensation by the white farmers who have been benefiting from rooibos without without due recognition of where this all came from. They are being paid the compensation. Nestle has to pay them compensation, and these communities are using that compensation for community development. So even if these issues look really impossible from where you're sitting from a North American perspective or from a Western European perspective, the kind of persistence and right doing and right action finally gets you there. And I'm not in any way advocating for it to take hundreds and thousands of years, but I'm just saying that when people get together with pure intention and with right-minded intention, and discussions like this, you should not underestimate the power of what can be shifted.
Thank you. Alex?
Well, first of all, were you saying that we are truth-telling historians?
Truth-tellers and historians?
Okay, I would never call myself a truth-teller. Never. Because so much harm has been done in history by people who claimed to tell the truth. So no, I will never make a claim to that. I try to make stories more complete or more multifaceted or more multi-dimensional or multi-perspective, but no, I mean, and to me, that might be adding some more truth, but I will never claim it as a truth. Well, that being said, denial is at the heart of what we're talking about, and I mean, all the examples Sylvia has been giving, and I mean, denial is part of power and power relations. Denial is, well, like Sylvia already said, it's cheaper than paying, than confessing that you might be wrong or that you haven't told everything or whatever. Denial is nationalism. Nationalism and national histories are based and drowned in denial, because it's only about we and never about them. So you deny the rest of the world. It's only about yourself. And denial is also in a lot of what Sylvia was saying. I really adored your lecture, Sylvia. I mean, giving what was it you said? Naming things that have been unnamed or that haven't got named. There's also denial in that, and there's also denial in the phrase "shut up and listen." I mean, you have denied before you shut up, etc., etc. And there is conscious denial, and there is subconscious denial and unconscious denial. But it's at the heart of it all. Denial is not listening, is not seeing, is not accepting others, is even not accepting yourself. And yeah, well, I could go on for hours, but I think that's, well, let me, and you can play with that in a way. I remember I wrote a book with 3 other authors, and it was named In Search of Silence, and this was about the silence about slavery. And we searched for examples all over the country, and there was this rich merchant's house on one of the canals in Amsterdam, and a rich family which is still there, and they have a family, how do you call that? A weaponry? No, heraldic. Well, you know what I mean.
Crest or
exactly, and they have a black man with a blindfold or well, whatever, on his head, and so we went there and asked them, can we use that in our book as an example of Black presence in the Netherlands, and as probably a link of your family to slavery? And they said, no, you can't. So what we did is, the page in the book that we had reserved for that illustration, we made it black, which was much more telling than the old illustration of that black herald.
Erwin, I've got a couple questions from people in the chat, so should I go ahead and just pose them?
Yeah, please do.
The first, we're being joined by Mitchell Assayas, who's joining us also from the Netherlands, from the Black Archives, and he's asking, saying that South Africa was not mentioned in the Apology of Mark Rutte, nor by King Willem-Alexander, and there's very little known about Dutch slavery in South Africa and the Netherlands. And just wondering your reflections on this. And I would just like to add, because we've got the partnership with Taiwan Fest, also there's not much known about the fact that there was a Dutch occupation by the Dutch East India Company from 1624 to 1662 and 1664 to 1668 of the island of Taiwan, which was known as Formosa. So just wondering whether or not you could comment about that, the fact that South Africa was not mentioned, and also this lack of knowledge about some of this history. First to you, Sylvia.
I find it remarkable that South Africa was not mentioned. And, you know, in fact, I had a little bit of an exchange with Sebastian about that at the time. And one of the things that brought hope into the situation was that he said it was a comma on the journey. And yes, that it is a journey. But something that I have to mention that I found very disturbing, when we did the play in the Netherlands for those 6 weeks, and we went all around, even to the town where Jan van Riebeeck was born in Culemborg, people didn't know about him. People didn't know Van Riebeeck. In South Africa, every second white street in a formerly white neighborhood is called Van Riebeeck. There are white Van Riebeeck high schools, there are Van Riebeeck hostels, Van Riebeeck buildings. I mean, we are inundated by the presence of this man that some South Africans have seen as their ancestor. But not only did people not know about him, but at the end of every performance, we would have a Q&A and we had discussions with the audience. People were really disturbed. I remember there was one performance we had where it was so unsettling for the cast and the director and myself, because after the play had ended and the lights went down and there's normally applause and people stand up, people just sat and there was just silence for 2 minutes. And 2 minutes is a long time for the cast. And we just felt that they hated it. But afterwards, we realized that they were so shaken by being told the story, being told some historic facts that they never knew. And I find that in a modern country like Holland, with its expensive education system, with all the resources that you have, the fact that people don't know their history is truly disturbing and disgusting. And I think that when we are talking about moving from apology to accountability, it's probably a very good place to start at home and start by educating people out of that somnambulant state that they're in about their history.
Yeah, this is such an important point, that's another key part of it, is that accountability is about the stories we tell and continue to pass on to the next generation, and that it should be part of our discussions within our society. So thank you so much for that, Sylvia. In a moment, Alex, I'm going to ask you about that same, lack of discussion with some of these aspects. But while we do that, in a moment, I'll do that. I just want to also note that we're at the hour. So for those who need to depart, we totally understand. We're going to continue for another few minutes. And for looking up upcoming events, I'll just put the Dutch Cultural Association of BC's website into the chat here. And I'd also like to welcome back Consul General Sebastian Messerschmidt, if you are able to join us now for your own reflections. Great, thank you. And Alex, I'll start with you, and just want to also bring in the question from Chantal, who in the chat was asking, is there more of an openness to this conversation, or is polarization making this much more difficult? I just want to put that question also into the air. But first, over to you, Alex, for your reflections about why certain stories are not told, why certain histories are forgotten. Over to you.
Well, why are certain histories forgotten or not told is part of what we were talking just a couple of minutes ago, because that's part of power. Those in power have no advantage in telling stories which might be criticizing them or undermining their power. But it is changing. I mean, more stories are told now, also in schools and also in school books. It's a bit better than before, and like Sylvia also said, and others, it's a process which is a very, very slow process. I won't see the end of that process during my lifetime. I'm very much convinced about it. But I'm also at an age in which I can look back and see that things have been moving and are, in my opinion, moving towards a positive direction, with lots of ups and downs. But still there is movement, and I think there is a bit more openness growing to critical histories and critical positions than before. But there's the paradox of it all is that at the same time, the amount of education in history is decreasing. It's horrible. On the one hand, there's an enormous increase in interest in history, documentaries on television and plays, etc. But what children are taught in school is just this. And after the second year in secondary education, 2/3 of the children don't have history anymore at all. Imagine, no history at all at an age in which you become aware, in which you learn about what society is about, where you have to learn where you come from and where you're going to. I mean, that's horrible.
Yeah.
So that's also a process we have to stop, because it's not only about colonial history and slavery. It's also about the position of women, or well, anything that goes on in this society. So, and why did the king not address South Africa or Asia? I think that's a political decision. And I don't know if he made that himself, because he cannot say something else than the prime minister. The prime minister and his cabinet are responsible for the words of the king, so he cannot say something else. And what he did was admirable, because he did give it an other tone of voice and some other words than the prime minister did. But I think that's a political decision. So now we cater with our apologies to the Afro-Dutch from Surinamese and Caribbean descent, because their voice is the loudest at this moment in this country. And then afterwards, maybe we can cater to South Africa as well, or to Indonesia and India and Sri Lanka and Taiwan as well. But that's secondary. I think that's a political decision.
No, thank you also, Alex, for reinforcing what Sylvia, you were saying about the importance of bringing this into the education system and history generally. I mean, if we're even looking into the future, we have to have a deep understanding of our history. And also, the political nature of these apologies and the kind of scope that they can have, but also, as you're saying, that there is, in your view, this change that has been taking place. Sebastian, you've heard now both Alex and Sylvia speak. Your reflections.
Yes. Well, I'm going to add Alex to my favorite list of storytellers. Thank you for this. And Sylvia was already up there. Art speaks where we shy away. So art is a really good method to kind of bring that story out and to get us curious. From denial to curiosity, I think, is a very big shift that many of us need to make, especially those who don't even know that they're in their bubble and don't even know that they don't have that historical context. And I personally have seen Black Lives Matter change the Dutch society to that extent, that where it used to be just a small group of people making a lot of noise about our slavery past, now it becomes a more commonplace conversation about who we are and what the past is the role of the past is in it. So I hope also for the listeners here today is that curiosity has been created. Oh,
you're with us, Sebastian.
Yeah, I was thrown out because somebody was calling me. So I would say, like, look up place like Rotterdam, go look at Sites of Memory, Jennifer Tosh and Katie Streek in the Netherlands, who also export their program to South Africa and other places. Johan Fourie in University of Stellenbosch, who takes the archives of the VOC and actually creates art with people to kind of translate all this information into accessible and interesting formats. So that kind of work, I think, is pivotal. Next to, of course, that we just need formal education to educate ourselves about who we are, where we're from, and educate each other. So I'm quite optimistic with what you've done today. Also, as Dutch Cultural Association in BC, I commend you for it. I think it's brave, and I think it's important to also talk to Dutchies abroad. Like, we didn't end up here by accident or by chance, and it does have an impact. So who are we, and how do we relate? Is a really important question. So my kudos to DCABC. I really respect what you're doing here. I had more or less the same question to Alex that you already asked. Like, how is it that the education system has been able to keep this subject of our slavery past so small, whereas such an important part of our history? Before I went to South Africa, I knew very little about the VOC, to be honest, other than spices that we were trading and got very rich in a golden age. So yeah, the education bit, I think, is pivotal. That would be my quick thoughts after hearing these great speakers share their thoughts.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. I'm mindful of the time and the late night for our guests. Vanessa, should we go to wrap things up, or how do you
Yeah,
feel?
I just think any final reflections, Alex, and then Sylvia, something to leave us with as we move into the closing here. Alex, over to you.
Sorry, I didn't get that. What are you expecting of me?
Oh, yeah, just any closing reflections, and perhaps you want to speak to what Sebastian was just saying about incorporating much more of this into our formal education. But any closing reflections you'd like to leave us with, thoughts as Sylvia, you were mentioning, you know, that there's things we really want to be naming at this point. And so just wondering what just any closing reflections you leave us with today.
Okay.
Over to Alex first, and then we'll end with Sylvia. Go ahead, Alex.
Thank you. Yeah, well, one thing is I completely agree with the deep listening. It's one of the things I try to do myself, and the things I try to distribute to others as well. But next to deep listening is deep talking, I think, because talking is sometimes so cheap. And to be honest, I found the apologies by the Prime Minister less deep and more cheap than those of the King, but still. I mean, we talk about the comma and not the full stop. But I haven't seen so much comma yet. And I don't know whether, and we are pressing that. And well, Mitchell Isaias was just there, and he's one of the leaders in that, that the comma is so important because, for example, there is this CARICOM program, 10-point action program in how to make reparations work, or what are reparations in this case. And it's the 10 points action plan starts with apologizing, but then there are still 9 points to go, 9 steps to go. And I haven't seen much movement yet from our government towards those 9 points. So that will be the fight for the coming years and maybe even decades. I don't hope so, but I'm a bit realistic. I've seen a lot of movement, I've seen a lot of change, but we're now on the first step of the ladder. 9 more steps to go. And the 10th step is the start of the healing process. Then healing starts when we're 9 steps ahead. So this is not to be pessimistic, not at all, but let's also be realistic, and let's also be very much alert. That's what I'm saying, that yes, apologies, very fine, it has to be made, and it's good that it has been made, and it's also very helpful in making other people believe that this is a serious subject, a serious theme, because the Prime Minister has talked about it and the King, but it's only the beginning.
Great. Thank you so much, Alex. And Frank had actually asked that question. What are the next steps in Netherlands and the countries that were on the receiving end of slavery? What actions or support can we consider? And you're speaking exactly to that. Thank you so much. And it really does parallel, as we're hearing from Marie Wilson as well, that there is parallels with Canada and the unfolding Indigenous issues here in terms of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. Sylvia, closing reflections from you.
I just want to go back to that question from Chantal Sturkenboom, and it's wonderful to have her and people like Marie Wilson in the room, about is there a new openness? And I think the one thing that apartheid taught me is that you can't wait for an openness. You have to create the openings. When the thing is uncomfortable, when it's something this big that needs to change, when there is so much denial, when there's so much vested interest, when there's so many powerful forces ranged against you, you have to push. And so what changed apartheid wasn't because the government suddenly sat up one day and thought, oh, this is bad, we shouldn't do it any longer. No, they were pushed, and really pushed painfully by protests, by people dying and laying down their lives to get rid of it. And so this is going to be a painful push. And it takes me back to my original point. The apology from the king, the apology from the premier, yeah, it's nice, fuzzy, warm feeling, it's okay. But as a South African, we know that they are not in charge of this process. We know that for change this massive to happen, it is not up to us. This is a divine journey, and we are led by ancestral guidance, and we are led by a world community that has the power to change it. And so what should happen is that politicians and kings and all of those people should look at what is happening around them in the world and what people are doing. And the people who are at the forefront of this kind of change are not in their cabinets, are not in the king's palace. They are out there doing amazing things. And that's where my optimism comes from.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. And to Alex, and I think for our Dutch-Canadian participants today, and also people who are watching this on YouTube, place-based redress is something that we can do. So we go past this conversation of 10 years. We're up to 10 years of reconciliation in Canada, right? But we're still not even talking about redress, which is the other word for reparations. So place-based redress is something that we can all do in our lives as settlers. And so today's conversation is a step towards that understanding that redress awaits us. And as Dutch settlers in Canada, this is work that we can do. We're honored to be able to do this work with our Dutch colleagues, with our Dutch compatriots who are living in Canada. We're aided today by two profound speakers, Alex and Sylvia. Thank you so much for your time. Also like to thank Simon Fraser University Institute for the Humanities, and also the Taiwan Festival and Society of We Are Canadians Too, for supporting the costs for today. And we'll just wrap with some event announcements, but thank you so much, Sylvia and Alex, for joining us. I know it's nighttime, so gelijk nabet, and thank you so much for spending your evening with us.
And the Consul General as well, Sebastian Messerschmidt, thank you, and also for connecting us to Sylvia, really, and all the participants, thank you. We just have a few announcements for upcoming events, but a big thank you.
Good, thank you. All right, and so we are participating with the Taiwan Festival. It's called Self-Portraits of Formosa, Reminiscing the Dutch, and we have several events coming up in the next 2 weeks. So I welcome you to check out our website for those. One of them is a concert with Diederik van Dijk from Nederlands, a cellist, with Sammy Chien, an extraordinary media artist from Taiwan who lives in Vancouver. A collaborative performance, not to be missed. It's free, it's outdoors on the plaza on the north side of the Vancouver Art Gallery. All these are on our website. Dutch DJ Tobias van Veen. Myself, I'll be giving a talk in Toronto at Taiwan Festival Toronto next week, Saturday. It's a free talk at Harbourfront, and also a talk in Vancouver at the Vancouver Art Gallery. On a similar, you've heard a little bit of what I'll be speaking about in today's conversation. And also we have a film screening on Dutch curatorial practices, White Balls on Walls. And we also have the first ever Dutch street market taking over Granville Street, the 600 block of Granville Street, from September the 2nd to September the 4th. If you'd like to volunteer, do send us an email, info@dutchbc.ca, and we'd love to have you participate. There'll be a huge tulip bulb market, a flower market, there'll be stroopwafels, there'll be Dutch street food, schulbak, there'll be double Dutch skip roping, there'll be lots of stuff, DJs all 3 days. And continuing in this conversation, the legacy of Dutch Brazil, looking at the history of the West-Indische Company, looking at the history of the VOC and the WIC and occupation of Brazil. So we know we did a poll with our members, and our members' #1 choice of subjects was history. So we are giving our members what they asked for, which is history. And of course, we also do love DJ parties and film screenings and author events. So we welcome you to join us along this journey, and check out our website, dutchbc.ca, to find out more and to join as a member, to stay abreast of this work and to really participate and walk together. This is work that we all can do together, stronger together. And thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you. Have a great day.